According to former presidential candidate, political analyst, and author Pat Buchanan, America faces a crisis of democracy. Buchanan warns of the rising deficit, the gridlock in Washington, D.C., and a possible war with Iran. Well, he joins me today for more details. Mr. Buchanan, I want to thank you for speaking with me. So you wrote an article recently entitled Liquidating the Empire, and you warn of, as you say, the sort of death of the American imperium. What do you mean by that?
Well, the United States is facing a deficit this year of 11% of the entire American economy. We've never had a deficit of that size, except in wartime, World War II, and that came to an end. And we've got these enormous deficits as far as the eye can see. And Republicans aren't going to raise taxes. Democrats aren't going to cut social spending or entitlements. And that leaves $1 trillion pot of money, $1 trillion pot of money for national defense, Afghanistan, Iraq, foreign aid, the State Department, all our contractors. So I think that what's going to happen is that that's going to eventually be the sacred cow that is cut. And I think just like the Soviet Empire in 1989 to 1991, basically collapsed and withdrew from Europe and the world, I think that fate eventually awaits the American imperium or American empire, as I call it. And I don't think it can be held off for too long.
You also warn that America faces a crisis of democracy, and that at the heart of this is the fiscal crisis, like you said. But I want you to bring China into the equation and the Treasury bills. Is Beijing bailing?
Well, what's happening, of course, the United States has run up in trade deficits alone in the last 20 years, $6 trillion. That means we've got to borrow that money from somewhere abroad to pay for all these imports into the United States. And in the last 10 years, China has been the primary candidate to lend us the money and both sell us the goods and lend us the money. And the Chinese have $2 trillion in reserves, $2.3 trillion. And in terms of T-bills, they had about $800 billion. In December, they sold $45 billion worth of those T-bills, and that tells me that the Chinese are getting tired of taking on American debt. They want to diversify. They want to get rid of it. If you have a sudden situation where the whole world says, look, the Americans one day are going to default on these debts or they're going to inflate their currency, it is time to get out, I think then you could have a situation where the United States becomes a worldwide Lehman Brothers, where all of a sudden everybody runs away from its debt.
Because of some of these issues, you know, the Tea Party movement, at least for now, has gained some momentum. What do you think of the Tea Partiers? I mean, is this a political party? Is it a cult? Is it here to stay?
It is not a cult, and it is not a political party. It is a mass movement. When I ran in 1992, the Buchanan brigades were sort of Tea Party people. They were rebelling against what they saw as the establishment of both political parties that had walked America into this terrible situation, had both conducted themselves badly, and neither had the answer. And that's what this Tea Party movement is like today, but it's much larger. It's people in both parties, and especially independents, and they have no confidence in the government of the United States, no confidence in Wall Street, no confidence in any institution. Their problem is they are mainly protests. They know how to defeat candidates, but they don't have, if you will, sort of a governing elite that they could put into power their own party, which could govern the nation.
And you were the face of the Buchanan brigades. Who's the face of the Tea Party movement?
They have no national candidate right now. The closest to it, I think, would be Sarah Palin.
It seems like when it comes to foreign policy and defense spending, there's not much of a difference between conservatives and liberals. And you brought up a really good point that America sort of borrows billions and billions of dollars from these countries, like China, to protect Asia from China, or borrows from the world to protect that same world. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, right. I think too many Americans are acting as though this is the 1950s and 1960s, when America was the only country that came out of World War II, not only undamaged, but the richest country on earth with all the money in the world, producing 50% of the manufacturers of the world. We could afford foreign aid, defend a fight in Vietnam, 50,000 troops in Korea, 300,000 in Europe, 500,000 in Vietnam. Now we've come to a point where America basically is approaching bankruptcy. And now to defend Europe, for example, we have to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars from Europe. To defend the Persian Gulf, we have to borrow scores of $1 billion from the Arab Gulf states to defend the Arab Gulf states.
Doesn't anyone else see the irony?
I mean, it's the absurdity of it all is that we're borrowing from the world to keep troops all over the world defending the world.
But you also say that, having so many troops all around the world, having so many bases, does not necessarily make America more safe.
I don't believe it does. I think the United States, during the Cold War, when the Chinese and the Soviets were together as an enormous empire, enormously powerful, thousands of nuclear weapons, 1 billion people, all the way from the Elbe River to East Asia, you need bases all over the world if you're going to contain it. But the Soviet Empire doesn't exist anymore, and Russia is democratic, and China has given up world communist revolution and is in state capitalist mode selling to us. So you don't need all those bases anymore. For heaven's sakes, why would we have bases in Central Asia? I understand for Afghanistan, but when Afghanistan is over, shut them down. Why don't we turn NATO over to the Europeans? The Russians are back at the Ural Mountains now. They're not on the Elbe River. Why don't we turn NATO over to the Europeans, frankly, and why don't we get the American troops out of South Korea?
Well, speaking of defense, I want to speak about Iran. In regards to Iran's nuclear program, you actually posed this question. Is Iran running a bluff? Right. First of all, what do you mean by that, and have you been able to answer that question?
I think it is an open question, and not enough people are asking it. First, the press secretary, Mr. Gibbs, the President of the United States, when Iran says, okay, if you won't sell us the enriched uranium just to 20% enriched, from which we make these medical isotopes, we're going to do it ourselves. And then they said the next day, we're doing it already. They took a little bit of their low-enriched uranium. And Gibbs said, we don't think they're able to do it. They're not able to enrich to 20%. How do they enrich to 90% for a bomb?
But at the same time, you said that there's mounting pressure on Barack Obama, even given everything that you just said, to impose crippling sanctions. And you seem to suggest that the next step would be war.
I believe that's right. Look, the Congress of the United States, the House voted 412 to 12 to impose crippling sanctions, by which they meant they were going to pressure every oil company in the world to stop selling gasoline to Iran. And Iran depends for 40% of its gasoline on imports. If you cut off a nation's gasoline and oil and energy and things like that, war often results. And my view is there is no hard, solid evidence the Iranians are anywhere near an atomic bomb. And if they aren't, keep negotiating with these people and don't start down the road to a third war in that part of the world when this country cannot afford the 2 wars it's already fighting.
You seem to be suggesting that in order for Obama to maintain his power, in order for the Democrats to maintain his power, that they might actually resort to war with Iran. Is that what you're saying?
There's no doubt that the Democrats are in grave trouble, and if the harder that line they take toward Iran, the more they move Iran up to the top issue on the table, because the American people are very concerned about Iran, I think it would strengthen the president undeniably. I think it would be a terrible thing to do, but it would strengthen him. I think that war would be a disaster for this country, and I think it would be a disaster for Iran. We've got 2 wars going already, but there's no doubt, if you take a look at where the pressure points are in this city, they are pushing toward a confrontation and toward a conflict with Iran.
Thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.